By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire stretched from the rain-soaked coasts of Britain to the deserts of Syria. The territory had simply grown too massive and faced too many active border threats for one person to govern alone. Looking at this map, you can see the Emperor Diocletian's solution. He engineered a meticulously planned power-sharing structure called the Tetrarchy. He split the empire's administration across 4 distinct zones, overseen by 2 senior emperors known as Augusti, and 2 junior successors waiting in the wings, called Caesars. But for this bureaucratic machine to actually run, it required a very specific human condition. The senior leaders had to rule side by side with zero jealousy, and the junior heirs had to wait patiently for their turn without a drop of ambition. Diocletian engineered what looked like a perfect administrative machine, but he overlooked the fact that he was building it out of flawed human parts. Look at the rigid, artificial embrace of the emperors in resculpture. It projects a mandated unity that would shatter immediately in the real world. The real test arrived when Diocletian and his co-ruler Maximian did the unthinkable. They voluntarily resigned, retiring to private life and leaving a massive power vacuum at the top of the Roman government. The new Eastern Augustus, an aggressive military commander named Galerius, had no interest in sharing power gracefully. He wanted to dominate the entire empire. He immediately manipulated the rules of succession. The vacant junior slots should have gone to the competent adult sons of the previous rulers, Constantine and Maxentius. Instead, Galerius appointed his own inexperienced nephew and a pleasure-seeking crony named Severus. This map illustrates the sheer math of his maneuver. By installing loyal proxies rather than independent heirs, Galerius effectively handed himself unchecked control over 3/4 of the Roman monarchy. By treating a constitutional succession process as a weapon for his own personal supremacy, Galerius guaranteed that the successors he bypassed would fight back. One of those bypassed heirs was Constantine. Galerius knew exactly how dangerous the young commander was, so he kept him closely guarded at the Eastern court, acting as a virtual hostage to keep the Western armies in line. Realizing his life was in danger, Constantine secured a reluctant permission to leave and immediately bolted. Galloping through the night across Europe, he outran any pursuit by severely crippling the public post horses behind him. He reached the military camp in Britain just in time. Merely days after his arrival, his father, the Western Augustus, passed away. The Western army didn't hesitate. Ignoring every constitutional rule of the Tetrarchy, the loyal legions unilaterally declared Constantine their new emperor. Galerius was furious, but he ran the numbers. Facing the threat of a massive, well-trained Western army, he swallowed his pride, backed down, and officially absorbed Constantine into the Tetrarchy as a junior Caesar. This military concession exposed a fatal vulnerability in the Roman state. Raw, localized military loyalty to a charismatic bloodline easily overpowered abstract bureaucratic rules. While the military system cracked in the West, the civilian system boiled over in Rome. Galerius decided to push his luck by imposing a rigorous, brutal property and headcount tax on the Italian populace. This chart demonstrates the historical shock of that decision. Ever since the conquest of Macedonia, Roman citizens had enjoyed an absolute exemption from personal taxes. Galerius wiped out 500 years of financial privilege with a single decree. The civilian backlash was explosive. Feeling financially cornered, the Roman public and the remnants of the Senate threw their support behind the other passed-over heir, Maxentius. Where Constantine had leveraged the swords of the Western legions to break the system, Maxentius weaponized civilian anger, political conspiracy, and the bruised ego of the ancient capital. Galerius's economic greed handed a ready-made rebellion to his enemies. It proved that constitutional frameworks crumble fast when they actively antagonize the people they govern. Panicking over the loss of Italy, Galerius ordered his hand-picked Caesar, Severus, to march on Rome and crush the uprising. But state enforcement vanished the moment Severus arrived. His troops had previously served under Maxentius's father. Allured by promises of money and old loyalties, they defected en masse to the rebels. Maxentius's father, the retired emperor Maximian, came out of isolation to lead the counteroffensive. He quickly trapped a fleeing, destitute Severus inside the heavily fortified, swamp-ringed city of Ravenna. Maximian knew a physical siege would drain his resources, so he turned to psychological warfare. He fed Severus false reports of internal betrayal, convincing the paranoid commander to avoid a massacre and surrender voluntarily, under the promise of safe conduct. That promise was a lie. Severus was taken to Rome as a captive. He was granted the dark mockery of an imperial funeral, but the only choice he actually got was how to die. He chose to open his own veins. The suicide of a sitting Caesar marked the physical shattering of Diocletian's machine. It could no longer command troops, enforce its laws, or defend its leaders. Diocletian had spent decades carefully calibrating a system for peaceful succession. Once he stepped down, it took barely 18 months for that entire project to be eradicated. The Roman world plunged into 18 years of continuous discord. It suffered through 5 devastating civil wars as the empire was carved up by hostile warlords, constantly trying to expand their armies at the expense of their subjects. Order was only restored when the concept of shared power was entirely abandoned. Supreme authority reverted back to the man who struck first and hardest, Constantine. The ruin of the Tetrarchy leaves a stark historical lesson. You can engineer the most logical, brilliant political framework imaginable, but it will never survive the unchecked forces of human ambition and dynastic entitlement. For centuries, the Roman Empire operated on a simple, brutal logic. One absolute ruler holding total control. But by the early 4th century, that system had fractured, leaving a staggering 6 different men claiming the title of emperor at the exact same time. This map shows the Roman world carved into those 6 competing territories. The borders overlapped, jurisdictions clashed, and the sheer density of immense political ambitions crammed into a single continent made the arrangement entirely unsustainable. Up in the harsh northern provinces of Gaul, Constantine commanded the frontier. He was a disciplined, battle-tested general who spent his days defending the Rhine against incursions. Far to the south, his rival Maxentius enjoyed a very different reality. Having seized control of the capital city of Rome, he hoarded the endless wealth and ancient prestige of the Italian peninsula. The only thing preventing these younger rivals from tearing each other apart was the lingering terror inspired by the surviving elder emperors, veteran commanders like Galerius and Maximian, who had ruled the previous generation with an iron fist. This 6-way standoff was a ticking clock. The moment the old guard lost their grip on the empire, the younger generation would inevitably drag Rome into a massive civil war. The elder emperor Galerius was the first to test the new boundaries. He launched a massive, punitive invasion into Italy, intending to crush the defiant Maxentius and reassert Old World dominance over Rome. The campaign was a total humiliation. Fortified Italian cities locked their gates. Maxentius flooded the invaders' camps with bribes, and Galerius's own exhausted troops began deserting him, forcing a shameful retreat. Meanwhile, the other elder emperor, Maximian, sought political refuge up in Gaul. He presented himself to Constantine as a humbled, harmless retiree looking to live out his final years in peace. The retirement was a lie. As soon as Constantine marched north to fight the Franks, Maximian fabricated a report of Constantine's death, seized the imperial treasury at Arles, and began bribing soldiers to support a violent coup. Constantine reacted with terrifying speed. He loaded his troops onto boats, rode the rapid currents straight down the Rhone River, and trapped the treacherous Maximian inside the coastal fortress of Marseille before he could consolidate power. The punishment was absolute. Maximian was captured and forced to hang himself. Shortly after, over in the east, the humiliated Galerius succumbed to a gruesome flesh-eating disease. In a matter of months, the old guard was dead. The diplomatic buffers holding the empire together had evaporated, leaving the ambitious younger generation completely unchecked. Free from his father's shadow, Maxentius tightened his grip on Rome. He quickly transformed the ancient capital from a center of administration into an organized extortion racket. He extracted vast sums of wealth directly from the Senate. Using the threat of treason trials, he confiscated massive patrician estates to fund his extravagant lifestyle and secure his personal power. To enforce this corruption, he relied entirely on a bloated Praetorian Guard. He paid these armored units generously, allowing them to plunder the city and massacre defenseless civilians without any legal consequence. Safe inside his luxurious gardens, surrounded by paid mercenaries, Maxentius grew dangerously overconfident. He began announcing to his court that he alone was the true emperor, dismissing his rivals as mere lieutenants. He then made a fatal miscalculation. He ordered the violent destruction of Constantine's statues across Italy and Africa, erasing his rivals' honors while simultaneously massing troops along the northern border. This deliberate, public disrespect ended any possibility of negotiation. For Constantine, waiting in Gaul while an enemy mobilized meant waiting to be slaughtered. Constantine's generals and advisors begged him to remain defensive. Ignoring their panic, he ordered a preemptive strike, intending to march his forces directly into the heart of Italy. This chart breaks down the terrifying math of the impending invasion. On paper, Constantine was walking into a slaughter. Maxentius commanded a staggering 170,000 soldiers. He had drawn massive levies from Africa and Sicily, equipping them with the endless grain and gold hoarded inside Rome. Yet those immense numbers masked a critical flaw. These soldiers spent their days enjoying the baths, theaters, and comforts of the capital. They were severely out of practice and lacked basic battlefield discipline. Constantine, forced to leave over half his men behind to guard the Rhine frontier, marched south with an invasion force of exactly 40,000 men. The difference was in the composition. Every single man in Constantine's column was a hardened veteran. They had survived years of grueling warfare in the frozen mud of the northern borders, forging an absolute, unquestioning military obedience. Outnumbered 4-1, Constantine gathered his veterans and aimed his legions straight toward the towering snow-covered peaks of the Alps. The coming collision would test a harsh new reality. The ancient wealth and political titles of the capital were about to clash against the disciplined steel of the frontier legions, determining who would control the future of the continent.
The Roman Empire's grand experiment in shared power has collapsed. By the early 4th century, the vast territory is cracked into 4 heavily militarized zones, each controlled by a rival warlord. In the west, Constantine is mobilizing his battle-hardened legions in Gaul, preparing to strike. Across the Alps, Maxentius has locked down Italy, hoarding grain and fortifying the capital. Meanwhile, the east is split. Licinius commands highly disciplined veteran troops stationed in Illyricum, while Maximinus watches from his stronghold in Syria, plotting his own offensive. Peace is off the table. The remaining question is which of these 4 possesses the strategic genius and sheer ruthlessness to outlast the others. A government built on the premise of equal, divided power inevitably turns into a zero-sum game of elimination. Constantine struck first, taking a route no regular army had ever successfully used to invade. He led his forces straight over the Cottian Alps, marching with such speed that he descended into the plains of Italy before Maxentius even knew he had left the Rhine. At Turin, he met a massive army of heavily armored Eastern cavalry. The Italians formed a compact wedge, intending to trample his lines. Constantine simply stepped aside. He used flexible infantry formations to divide the wedge, let the heavy horses pass through, and enveloped them from the flanks. The sudden defeat sent a shockwave to Rome. Maxentius had planned to wait out a siege behind the city's massive walls, relying on his deep granaries. But the rapid collapse of his northern defenses and the roaring crowds in the circus mocking his cowardice forced him to march out and fight. He chose to meet Constantine at Saxa Rubra, 9 miles from Rome, but made a catastrophic error. He aligned his massive army with the deep, rapid waters of the Tiber River directly at their back. Quick, somber pacing. When Constantine's cavalry shattered their wings, the Italian infantry fled in a panic. Thousands rushed the narrow Milvian bridge. The crush of retreating soldiers pushed Maxentius into the river, where the immense weight of his own armor dragged him down to the mud. Constantine eliminated his rival by turning the physical geography of Italy from the peaks of the Alps to the current of the Tiber into a weapon. At the exact same time, a second war erupted in the east. Maximin decided to launch a surprise attack against Licinius,
dragging his army out of Syria in the dead of winter. The environment punished them for it. Severe storms, incessant rains, and deep snow decimated their ranks. By the time they reached Bithynia, Maximin had abandoned most of his heavy baggage and exhausted his men. Even with a massive numerical advantage, 70,000 men against Licinius's 30,000, the exhausted invaders broke. Licinius commanded Illyrian veterans trained in the harsh schools of earlier emperors. Their raw endurance and unbroken discipline held the line, crushing the larger army. Maximinus fled the battlefield in terror, abandoning his imperial robes to escape notice. He made it to Tarsus, but died just a few months later, leaving Licinius the undisputed master of the East. The West was conquered through agile maneuvering and tactical brilliance. The East was secured by weather, attrition, and the sheer grit of veteran legions standing their ground. Winning the war is entirely different from securing the peace. With their rivals dead, Constantine and Licinius immediately started dismantling any internal threats to their new authority. In Rome, Constantine targeted the institutions that had propped up Maxentius. He permanently disbanded the Praetorian Guard, destroying their fortified camp and scattering the survivors to the frontiers. Then, he turned the voluntary tribute the Senate had paid his rival into a mandatory, heavy, perpetual tax. While Constantine reorganized the bureaucracy, Licinius hunted down bloodlines. He launched a paranoid, systematic purge of anyone carrying the genetic legacy of former rulers. This included the innocent family of former Emperor Diocletian. His wife Prisca and daughter Valeria had spent 15 months wandering the provinces in disguise, trying to escape. When they were finally discovered in Thessalonica, Licinius had them immediately executed and thrown into the sea. Consolidating absolute authority required the total erasure of rival legacies, extinguishing the institutional memories and biological bloodlines of anyone who could ever challenge the throne. The Roman world was now sliced cleanly in half. Constantine ruled the West, Licinius ruled the East, and the two men were brothers-in-law, bound by an alliance and a marriage pact. It took barely a year for the peace to break. Licinius began using secret emissaries to correspond with Bassianus, a man Constantine had recently elevated to his own royal court, urging him to rebel against his new commander. Constantine intercepted the conspiracy, stripped Bassianus of his rank, and immediately marched his army into Pannonia to confront Licinius. They met near the city of Cibalus, clashing in a narrow, half-mile defile wedged between a steep hill and a deep morass. The armies fought to a grueling stalemate from dawn until dusk. Finally, Constantine led a massive cavalry charge from the right wing that shattered the eastern lines, forcing Licinius into a desperate, silent retreat under the cover of night. Reassembling a fractured empire allows for only one survivor. To claim the absolute peak of power, a ruler eventually has to turn his sword against the very allies who helped him reach it. This is the face of a man history remembers as a saint. Constantine the Great is celebrated as the legendary hero who unified the Roman world and laid the foundations of Western civilization. But if you lived under his rule, you knew a very different man. If you were convicted of simply being an accessory to an abduction, Constantine's severe law dictated that you must be violently executed by having molten lead poured directly down your throat. To understand this extreme cruelty, you have to look at the map. The Roman world was split in two. Constantine ruled the West, while his rival, Licinius, controlled the East. They had maintained an uneasy, fragile peace for 8 years. That peace was expensive. Endless military buildup required crushing taxes, leaving citizens so destitute they resorted to desperate measures to survive. Across Italy, families were so starved of resources, they began abandoning their newborn infants. Yet the same emperor who poured lead down throats suddenly intervened to save these children. Constantine authorized massive state funds, paying parents directly from the treasury so they could afford to raise their kids. Constantine aimed to consume the entire Roman world. To hold absolute power over a broken population, he weaponized whatever tools served his immediate needs, flipping between state-funded charity and the executioner's crucible of molten metal. Convinced of his own superiority, Constantine decided to tear up the peace treaty. Without any provocation, he marched his forces toward the eastern border to eliminate Licinius. This chart shows exactly what he was walking into. Licinius had amassed a massive defensive wall, 150,000 foot soldiers, and an armada of 350 galleys drawn from the wealthy ports of Egypt and Asia. By comparison, Constantine's numbers look inadequate, a total naval force of just 200 small ships and 120,000 ground troops. But those troops were hardened veterans who had survived 17 brutal campaigns, while Licinius's forces were mostly new levies, raw, untested recruits. The two forces met at the river Hebrus. Constantine's march ground to a halt against a broad, rapid river, with Licinius's massive army looking down at them from a steep, heavily fortified hill near the city of Hadrianople. Facing a numerically superior force entrenched on high ground, a direct assault would be suicide. To break the eastern defenses, Constantine had to rely on psychological manipulation and battlefield deception. Constantine ordered engineers to visibly construct a bridge across the river, drawing Licinius's attention to a fake crossing. Meanwhile, he secretly marched 5,000 archers in a wide loop, hiding them in a thick forest behind enemy lines. Confused by the sudden attacks from the rear, Licinius abandoned his high ground and was drawn out onto the open plain. That is exactly what the Western veterans wanted. In the brutal hand-to-hand combat that followed, 34,000 unorganized Eastern troops were slaughtered. Licinius fled into the walled city of Byzantium. The city was practically impregnable from land, meaning Constantine could not starve him out as long as the massive Eastern fleet controlled the surrounding sea. Breaking this stalemate required a naval assault. Constantine handed the job to his eldest son, Crispus, ordering him to take their tiny fleet and force a passage through the narrow Hellespont Straits, directly into the teeth of Licinius's armada. It was a suicide mission until the weather intervened. On the second day, a sudden south wind caught the sails of Crispus's small ships, and he used the momentum to drive his fleet straight into the tightly packed enemy formation. The maneuver shattered the Eastern Navy. 130 vessels were destroyed, and thousands of sailors drowned, and the straits were forced wide open. Constantine's supply lines poured in, and the siege of Byzantium began. By leveraging the terrain, exploiting a shift in the wind, and executing precise flanking maneuvers, Constantine completely neutralized the East's numerical supremacy. Licinius had nowhere left to hide. Licinius abandoned his massive stone fortress and scrambled to desperately raise a new army. But his raw, ill-disciplined recruits were easily crushed at the Battle of Chrysopolis. The Eastern military apparatus was totally destroyed. Defeated, Licinius retreated for the last time. But instead of a military standoff, Constantine was met with a political intervention. Constantia, Constantine's own sister and Licinius's wife, came forward to plead for her husband's life. To the shock of his generals, Constantine agreed. He swore a solemn oath to spare Licinius, pardoned his offenses, and even invited the broken emperor to dine with him at an imperial banquet that very evening. The mercy was a lie. Shortly after the banquet, Constantine broke his oath. He accused Licinius of a vague, unproven conspiracy, had him executed, and frantically began erasing every legal record and law from Licinius's reign. The final victory happened far from the front lines. Constantine unified the empire through cold-blooded betrayal, proving that survival required a leader capable of outmaneuvering his rivals through treachery rather than tactics. With his brother-in-law dead, the civil wars were over. For the first time in 37 years, the entire Roman world was united under a single, undisputed master. But historian Edward Gibbon points out a tragic irony in this victory. Constantine's relentless, lifelong campaign to consolidate and protect the empire actually accelerated its ultimate collapse. This chart models the economic fallout. Decades of continuous warfare burned through the empire's wealth. To maintain his grip, Constantine expanded the military, creating a bloated defense budget that crushed his citizens under a mountain of taxes. His ambition cleared space for a new capital and global religion, but the financial and human costs hollowed out the empire's core. History's great men almost always leave behind a debt written in the blood of their subjects.